Someone has been lying to you, and that does not sit right with me. I've talked a lot over the past few days over the deportations involving the Alien Enemies Act, and I've noticed a certain trend of misinformation running through the comments. And frankly, I don't blame these guys for being misinformed, because somebody is out there misinforming them. And that does not sit right with me. Now let's be clear, there are lots of legal issues involved in this situation, and not all of them are cut and dry. I've just noticed certain pieces of misinformation that keep being repeated over and over again in exactly the same tone. And when I hear misinformation in harmony, I figure somewhere out there, somebody's conducting an orchestra. So in the interest of factual clarification, I'm going to fill in some gaps. I'm Brian, I make videos about civics and law. Please like this video, comment, share, get it out there so people will see it. This is important information and people need to know this. Also, thank you guys for supporting me. Anybody who's interested in supporting me can do so by subscribing, following my Linktree. There are lots of ways to support me on my profile. I really appreciate your help. It's the only way I can keep doing this. Okay. Let's get through a couple of things. Now, a quick recap of the facts. The president deported a group of people on an airplane invoking the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. Now, there are 4 acts that were passed in 1798. One of them allowed the president to deport pretty much anybody he wanted to, but that one expired 2 years later. The Alien Enemies Act only allows the president to deport people with whom we are at war. And there's nuance there. And that's not what I'm talking about today. There's going to be some fun law involved there. That's not where the misinformation is. The word that keeps coming up that's problematic is jurisdiction. Now let's talk about a few of the arguments I've heard about jurisdiction. Because when the president deported these people, a DC Circuit judge ordered him to stop the deportation and eventually to turn the plane around and bring them back, as part of a preliminary injunction while the court took some time to sift through the rest of the facts and law of the case. But executive branch officials do not appear to have complied with that order from the judge. And there's going to be all kinds of law there to talk about. Again, not what I'm talking about today. What I am talking about is jurisdiction, because a number of people have claimed that that judge lacked jurisdiction to issue an order against the president, for several reasons, which we're going to talk about. The first reason I've heard several times is that the judge lacked jurisdiction because a state court judge cannot issue an order against the president. So let's talk about that first. Now, like the rest of the country, DC has 2 court systems. A federal court system and a state court system, even though they're not exactly a state. Because DC is not a state, Congress created a special court just for DC under its Article 1 powers. That court is where we have traffic court and have kind of local court issues. But DC also has a federal court under Article 3. So just like there are 93 district courts throughout the country, one of them is in Washington, DC. And it is separate from our local court. The case that we are talking about took place here, not here. So there was no state court judge involved, okay? Now we're going to delve a little deeper into jurisdiction now, but first we have to talk about who gets to decide whether or not a court has jurisdiction. Under US v. Ruiz and US v. Mine Workers of America, the federal courts get to decide for themselves whether or not they have jurisdiction. So what does that mean in this case? Well, the claim is that the president did not need to follow the court's order because the court had no jurisdiction. But that decision is not one that the president can make for himself. The court gets to make that decision. So even if the court lacks jurisdiction, it's up to the court to decide that, not the president. Now we're going to break down further whether or not the court may or may not have jurisdiction, but regardless, that does not let the president off the hook for following or not following the court's order. Only the court can decide that it does not have jurisdiction. Now I've heard 2 more basic arguments I want to get into. One is that this court lacks subject matter jurisdiction. That is very unlikely considering that this is a federal question, which is one of the subject matter jurisdictions allowed for a federal district court. The second is an issue with whether or not a district court judge is allowed to make an order that controls the President of the United States. Now, a case that we're going to be talking about today is Nixon v. United States. And in Nixon v. US, President Nixon was ordered to turn over some tapes, some recordings of himself in his office, where he was saying some things that were not super great for his case. And he did not want to turn these tapes over. And so he claimed executive privilege and said, I don't have to turn these tapes over. And eventually he lost, and he had to turn the tapes over to the court. And who issued the order that he turn over those tapes? Right there. DC District Court judge. So yes, a DC District Court judge can order the United States president to do something, and the United States president must comply. Okay, the last thing we're going to discuss is the political question doctrine, which is something I've heard way too much in the past 24 hours for it to be random. Political question doctrine is super obscure, very hard to understand, and for a number of people to be quoting it at me tells me that somebody is on a news channel talking about it a lot. Because all of these people are not suddenly becoming experts in political question doctrine. So let's talk about it for a minute. I've talked about this once before, but this use of the word political is different from what you normally think of when you hear the word political. We are talking about political and non-political branches of government. That does not mean partisan and non-partisan branches. It means political as in elected and non-elected. So, the legislature, Congress, political branch. The president, political branch. The Supreme Court, not a political branch. Does that mean they are not partisan? It does not. But it does mean that they are not elected, they are not a political branch of government. So the Supreme Court feels that there are some questions that come before them that belong answered by someone who's been elected. Policy is where someone has to sit down and think, we could either do A or B. A would have some good consequences and some bad consequences. B would have some good consequences and some bad consequences. Which one should I choose? And then they make a decision. That is a policy decision. Those decisions are made by politicians. And if at the end, the people who vote for them don't like the way it turns out, they lose their job. And I am perfectly happy staying away from policy decisions. And the political question doctrine is rooted in this idea, but I'm not sure it's still there. And I should tell you, the court does not turn down many cases using the political question doctrine. But every once in a while a case comes along and they're like, I'm sorry, we are not touching this. This is a question for the politicians. Now, technically, there is one case called Baker v. Carr, and it is the end-all be-all on political question doctrine. In that case, the court laid out 6 different things that they said would be political questions that they would not touch. And every single political question doctrine thing has to go through Baker v. Carr. And the 6 things are really confusing and spacey, and I do not like them. And frankly, we're not going to get into them right now. But we are going to talk about a couple of things. First, we're going to talk again about U.S. v. Nixon, because the U.S. v. Nixon attorneys asserted that that was a political question and should not have been answered by the court. And the court went through the Baker v. Carr analysis and said a couple of things. First, and very importantly, it said, courts must look behind the names that symbolize the parties to determine whether a justiciable case or controversy is presented. What that means is every time a political question doctrine issue comes up, the court has to evaluate it independently. That tells us 2 things. One, there's no clean and clear rule for political question doctrine, which means if anybody is telling you that this is clearly a political question doctrine, they're wrong. On the flip side, by the way, if anyone's telling you it's not a political question doctrine, who knows? They could also be wrong. The court works in mysterious ways. But the second thing it tells us is courts must look behind the names that symbolize. That means this is a question for courts to decide. So anyone suggesting that the President of the United States has the ability to determine whether or not this was a political question and make the decision for himself is absolutely incorrect. Once again, the court may change its mind tomorrow, but up until today, that has been the rule. So anyone who tells you otherwise is at the very least wrong about their history. I can't tell you what the future holds, but I can read the past. The last thing we have to talk about in political question doctrine is the one category of those 6 that is relevant to what we're talking about here. Because the courts have held that one category that is a political question doctrine issue has to do with foreign relations. And that's what a lot of these guys are hanging their hats on right now. Remember, they still don't get to make the decision. But will the court make the decision in their favor? Maybe. We'll find out. But let's talk about what they've done in the past. Historically, the court has found 4 different categories where they have applied political question doctrine to foreign affairs issues. First is determining when a war begins or ends. I think the question was whether or not people were allowed to start trading with the enemy after World War I. Like, was the war over yet? 2 is the recognition of a foreign power. So who is a foreign country? Who do we recognize as a foreign country? There's a particular country right now that you may or may not be thinking of that some people recognize and some people don't. The decision whether or not to recognize a country is up to Congress or whoever it is. The Supreme Court wants nothing to do with it. 3, ratification and verification of a treaty. Treaties are the president's domain, and the Supreme Court wants very little to do with it. And 4 is the president's use of the war powers. And this might be the place where this comes up, who knows? But this is usually about bombing people, not immigration issues. It has to be noted that in Baker, that kind of seminal case, the court says that just because something touches foreign affairs doesn't mean it's immune from judicial review. So foreign affairs is not automatically something that becomes not reviewable. And this is incredibly important, under U.S. v. Nixon, something that is traditionally reviewed by the court should not be a political question issue. The court reviews immigration issues frequently, so for it to suddenly decide that it can't do that anymore would be kind of surprising. Lily and Wendy, I want to thank you guys so much for your support. You've been helping me out immensely. Anybody else, if you want to subscribe or find one of the other ways to support me, I would really appreciate it. Go to my profile, go to my Linktree. There's a bunch of ways to support me from there, and I really, really appreciate all of your support. I can't keep doing this if you guys don't support me, so thank you very much. And as usual, keep commenting and getting this stuff out there so people will see it. Let me know if you have any further questions, and I will keep answering them. All right, thanks a lot, guys.